and we concoct an environment or a sphere, in a solar system of other vices that in a sense orbit around me to satisfy. And pride becomes that dark sun at the center of it all. Hello, I am Brother Francisco Whitaker, Benedictine monk of St. Vincent Arch Abbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and you are watching The Benedict Project. Today we conclude our discussion on monasticism and the 7 deadly sins, how St. Benedict and the early monastic fathers can help us in our struggles with sin. Today we hit the prince of the vices, the crown, the top dog, pride, which is really the root of all of the sins that we've been talking about, but in a special way is also the culmination of them. Before we begin our discussion on pride, though, make sure you like this video, subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so you never miss any of our podcast, monastic, or new awesome content. In a discussion on the 7 deadly sins, pride takes the chief place, because in a sense, it is both the first and the last sin to discuss. All sins, the vices from gluttony, sloth, greed, all of them, in a sense, are rooted in pride, because a sin is a turning away from God, saying, I prefer myself over you, or I prefer myself over others, which is fundamentally just the base level of what pride is, choosing me over anyone else, including God. So in a sense, pride is the chief, and it's the first before all of those sins, but is also the end of all of those sins. Because when we give in to vice, when we give in to temptation over and over and over again, and it becomes part of us, we turn into a vicious person. The only way we can continue coping or continue falling in to these sins is to also kind of turn back to pride, saying that I deserve this, I have this by right, or I can't be anything more than this, so I might as well keep on going. Now, if that latter part sounds like, well, that doesn't sound like pride, well, stay tuned, because we're going to see how pride isn't just exaltation of oneself, but it can actually be also a deprecation of self. So today's discussion will be focusing mainly on St. Benedict, but we'll also be drawing in some of St. John Cassian, who predates Benedict as a monastic writer. So pride, well, where does it come from? Well, first and foremost, Benedict says pride is the root of self-will, a belief or a practice that seeks to fulfill what I believe I need or what I believe I want. So really, the other 6 of the 7 deadly sins are a response to the first sin of pride that says I deserve or I need something to be satisfied. That is not God. Because if we believe that we need to be satisfied, that's not necessarily wrong. That's true. We do, in our heart's deepest need, have a place that needs to be satisfied. But that is only truly satisfied by receiving the love of God and having a relationship with Him. So that desire to be satisfied, it is not itself pride. But what pride says is, I deserve it to be dissatisfied by the way I choose. Humility, the opposite of pride, would say that I choose God because I see that He is really what gives me my satisfaction. But pride, on the other hand, says I can create, I can find, or I am the end of my own satisfaction. That is not something or someone outside of me that I must receive. It is rather something outside of me that I must take and draw in. Pride, the middle letter of it is I. Pride statements always begin with something about the self. I. So Benedict cautions his monks about the evil of self-will, or the plague of self-will, that it poses obedience, stability, the ability to just stay in place, silence, because if we're silent, we can't make ourselves heard. Our will isn't being dominated over others. So he cautions about this detriment, this plague, this evil of self-will, which demands constant and frequent satisfaction of the self. It is opposed to the will of God, and is opposed to any other people imposing what we believe is an imposition anyways, of their wills or their desires on me. Pride says, I am the center of the universe. I must be what everything is aimed towards. And we concoct an environment or a sphere, in a solar system of other vices that in a sense orbit around me to satisfy. And pride becomes that dark sun at the center of it all. John Cassian even sees pride as the sin that makes God my enemy. It makes God my opponent. Because if I am everything, if I am the one to be satisfied, then God stands directly as a threat to my satisfaction because his power, his omnipotence, his will potentially contradict my own. So pride is to say, no, God, let me play you. Let me play God. That's why pride is the first sin that Adam and Eve fell into, because Satan tempted them. Did God really say that? But rather, if you eat this fruit, you will become like gods, which is to then say you won't need him. So pride, when we fall into pride, or this belief that I don't need God, I don't need other people, I can satisfy myself, my needs are the most important, we are creating ourselves into an idol. Now, that's probably the main understanding of pride that you would hear, or that makes kind of sense. But I alluded to pride actually having another side, a darker side, a more subtle side, which manifests itself in the form of self-deprecation or self-loathing. Now, this sounds really backwards, right? If pride is about the exaltation of the self, how could self-loathing be a form of pride? Well, it's because John Cassian, Evagrius, and even Benedict see that pride isn't just about the self-will, isn't just about raising the self up, but it's about looking at the self first and foremost and only. So yes, there's a manifestation of self-glorification, self-dominance, and this need to have everything about me satisfied. But on the other side, pride really is just, in its most simple form, looking at the self. So that the devil's whole goal, since he is the prince of pride, he said, I won't serve God because he thought that he was better than God's plan, that he knew better. His whole goal for us is to repeat that same thing and to make us look at ourselves rather than God. So the first thing that I talked about is, of course, looking at the self, how I need to be satisfied, how I am better than other people, how I know better than God. But on the other half, it is still looking in the mirror when we look at ourselves and say, I'm a piece of garbage. I'm good for nothing. No one can love me. God can't forgive me. I can't be better than what I am now. The goal is still achieved, because what are you doing but looking at yourself? C.S. Lewis has a definition for humility where he says, humility is not so much thinking less of yourself, lower, but rather thinking of yourself less, or less often. So therefore, in contrast, pride isn't necessarily thinking more of yourself, but rather thinking of yourself more. Which means that we can think about ourselves more, not just simply because we want everything to be about us, center of the universe, but when we think we are on the other side of the universe, we're so much worse than everyone. I'm so much more far gone. Yes, God loves everyone, but he can't quite love me. And that mindset leads to the other deadly sins still as well. Because when we are in a hopeless place and we believe that I can't be forgiven, I'm good for nothing, no one can love me, what's the point? Then none of those sins really seem that much worse. Yeah, well, I might as well amass money because I can't have really anything true. I can at least have this semblance of something. Or lust and gluttony. I might as well feed myself because I'm a pig anyways. it's still pride. And it sounds strange and backwards how that's still pride, but it's because it draws us away from the reality of the other, the reality of whether it's God or another person. This mirror gazing, navel gazing, looking at me inwardly, whether it's in exaltation or deprecation, is pride. So, how do we overcome those things? How do we move away from making God an opposition? And that self-deprecation is also making God an opposition, because it says, you can't forgive me. You stand as a reminder of how bad I am. So I don't want to think about you either, God, because you're supposed to be all caring, but you can't be for me. God is a threat to me. Well, how do we move away from that? How do we move away from making God an opposition or having this self-will to dominate or to detract? Well, Benedict has a recipe, a 12-step program, the 12 steps of humility. And I'm not going to go over all of them. In fact, I have a video, actually a couple of videos about humility. So check those out if you want to find even more explanations based on the rule about how to grow in this really challenging but incredibly necessary virtue. But I will focus on 3, and then one thing from John Cassian. So first, Benedict says, you must remember that you are dust. Right? We're in the season of Lent. We say when we receive ashes, remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Benedict says we must remember that we are dust. Now, he is not saying think yourself as dirt, worse than dirt, right? That's the whole self-deprecation side of pride. Rather, he's saying, what are you without God? Nothing. None of us are anything without God. Jesus himself said, apart from me, you can do nothing. Not you can't do most things. You can't do anything. Pride believes that we can do something without God. Or that, well, God couldn't do anything with me at all, so I might as well do whatever. Benedict says you must remember you are dust. But what does God do with dust in creation, in Genesis? He breathes his life into it. We must remember, in remembering that we're dust, where we are, what we are, and who we are in relation to God. God is God, we are not. That's what Benedict is saying. That's one step. Second, Benedict also says that we must not believe that there's anything beneath us. There is any task, any relationship, any activity that is somehow lower than us, that we are above those things. Because as soon as we do that, we then see people who are maybe working in that way or dress a certain way, act a certain way, look a certain way, whatever it is, that they too become beneath us. And as soon as we place ourselves above even one person, we can place ourselves above God. It is that close of a step. So he says, be content with lower things. Be content with not being noticed, with having the regular menial tasks of the day that go on and on all the time. Be okay with them. And don't believe you have a right to something better. God gives us graces. We twist them into believing they are rights. But rather, we must be content with the lower menial things, the everyday tasks, the things that no one noticed and no one cares about, and just be okay and accept that that's where we are maybe today. Knocks us down a couple of pegs and grows a little bit of humility within us. Finally, Benedict says that a monk must never seek to be called humble until he really is. And then when he really is, he will no longer seek to be called humble. So underneath this is kind of 2 aspects. First, in seeking to be called humble, it automatically kind of undoes the whole humility. As soon as you say, I'm a humble person, you immediately actually create a pride situation for yourself. But what Benedict is really getting at is stop comparing. Stop looking at the brother monk across the choir stalls from you and thinking, I'm better than him, I'm more humble than him, I care more, I pray more. Or on the other hand, he's better than me. Man, I wish I was like him. I wish I prayed like him. I wish I was popular like him. Or I wish I could sing like him. Whatever it is, we live our life based on comparison in so many ways. And that will feed either self-deprecation or self-exaltation. Benedict says, you gotta stop. You gotta stop comparing yourself with others. And how do we do that? Thank God for everything you've been given, and thank God for everything that person has been given. This is the aspect of pride that's connected to envy. And because pride is rooted in all the other sins, we can see some of those sins surfacing even in our singular description of pride. So in that comparison, look at just yourself and say, this is what God's working with. I'm not going to worry about those other people right now. What does God have in store for me today? What does he desire for me to do today? How can I glorify him today? How have I not glorified him today? All of those are reminders of where we are in relationship to God, where we are in relationship to others. Humility is to accept where I am, to be grounded. The word humility comes from humus, which is Latin for ground or earth. To be humble means to be well grounded in your identity as a son or daughter of God, brother of Christ, and a temple of the Holy Spirit. Anything else outside of that identity is a creation of ourselves. Living in our identity is to live grounded and humble. So John Cashin, what does he say? How can we overcome pride? Well, ultimately, he says the best way is to also work on the other sins that lead to it and that stem from it. Because we really won't be able to tackle pride until the symptoms of pride along the way or the dark fruits or effects of pride are also taken care of. It's really hard to get at a root of a plant if it's so massive you can't even get to the trunk. It is really necessary to uproot the plant and take it out by its roots so it no longer grows. But you have to probably trim it in order to get to that place. So John Cashin says, look at these other sins. Maybe start with some of the ones that you can manage a little bit more. It's really hard to manage at all. But how can you manage a little bit more? So the sins like gluttony or sloth or lust, those might seem really big to us. But it is actually a lot easier, and Thomas Aquinas agrees with this, to start by working on those. Because if pride is the underlying of all of those sins, by working on them, we are actually also working on pride. And eventually when it comes down to where we're really faced with pride singularly before us, we'll have been trained in order to combat sin. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned something from this discussion about pride and humility and how to grow from it. If there's more questions you have, please leave them in a comment below. If there's anything you like this video, share it with someone. If you want to see more videos about humility, you can check out this one and this one, as well as check out the playlist of all of the 7 deadly sins here. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a wonderful day. God bless.